In the cold grey dawn of February 1945, a C-47 transport plane cut through Atlantic winds toward the American coastline. Inside, a dozen German nurses captured months earlier in France sat strapped to canvas seats, their eyes hollow from exhaustion and disbelief. Their Red Cross armbands were stained, their hands trembling from both fear and cold. The war in Europe was collapsing, yet for these women, the journey was only beginning. When the aircraft descended over New York Harbor, none of them knew what awaited on the other side. They had been told by German officers that capture meant humiliation, perhaps death. Instead, as the wheels touched down on the runway of Mitchell Field, they saw American medics waiting not with rifles, but with stretchers and blankets. The snow glittered under floodlights as the engines slowed, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any threat. The women had been taken near Aachen, where field hospitals had turned into battlefields, themselves. Their unit, part of the Wehrmacht's medical corps, had been treating both soldiers and civilians under bombardment when American infantry overran their position. They expected punishment. Instead, U.S. officers ordered that they be treated as non-combatants. The nurses were bewildered. They had been trained to view Americans as destroyers, merciless, mechanical, godless. Yet the men who guarded them offered cigarettes and chocolate. And when one nurse coughed blood into her sleeve, a medic rushed forward with concern instead of contempt. That was their first moment of confusion. The enemy seemed determined to save them. When the nurses were transferred to U.S. hospitals, the strangeness only deepened. At Camp Shanks and later at Walter Reed, they were assigned clean rooms, given new uniforms marked POW, and fed regular meals. The contrast with wartime Europe was staggering. Gone were the freezing tents and spoiled rations. Here, everything ran with impossible. Precision white corridors gleaming with disinfectant, nurses in pressed uniforms moving like clockwork, the low hum of heating systems that never failed. The German women were both fascinated and unsettled. "Everything smells of soap," one whispered to another. For them, hygiene itself felt like luxury. To the American staff, the idea of caring for enemy nurses was not an act of charity, but of principle. The Geneva Conventions demanded humane treatment, but the U.S. Army Medical Department went further, insisting that captured medical personnel be given duties consistent with their training. Within weeks, the German nurses were helping tend to wounded POWs, sometimes their own countrymen. It was a strange mirror. Germans healing, Germans under the supervision of Americans. At first, suspicion hung thick in the wards. Some U.S. doctors feared sabotage. Others simply didn't know how to speak to women who had once served Hitler's army. But discipline and professionalism won out. Work became the bridge language. The German nurses quickly earned respect for their skill. They were efficient, meticulous, and unflinchingly calm under pressure. Many had been trained under conditions far harsher than their American counterparts, operating with candlelight, no anesthesia, and constant shelling. Their poise impressed even the most skeptical officers. One American surgeon remarked that they handled scalpels as if born with them. In the operating theaters, former enemies stood shoulder to shoulder, saving lives instead of taking them. The nurses, who had once patched up soldiers screaming, "Für das Vaterland," now heard quiet English prayers over American stretchers. The familiarity of blood, gauze, and pain transcended the flags they'd served. Yet beneath that calm surface, each woman carried a private storm. They had left families behind in bombed-out cities, Cologne, Dresden, Berlin. Letters, when they came, were censored or delayed. Some nurses learned that their hospitals had been destroyed, their patients buried under rubble. The guilt of survival grew heavier by the day. One wrote in her journal that she could not sleep without hearing the echo of falling bombs. "We mend their wounds," she noted, "but who will mend ours?" Even surrounded by kindness, captivity remained captivity. They were free to walk hospital grounds, but forbidden to leave. Freedom, they realized, was not measured in distance, but in the weight of memory. The American doctors understood more than they let on. Many had seen what war did to the mind. Shell, shock, grief, and moral fatigue did not respect uniforms. Some quietly encouraged the German women to attend English classes or help with Red Cross drives for wounded veterans. Gradually, the air of suspicion dissolved into something closer to respect. The nurses began assisting in the rehabilitation wards, helping amputees learn to walk again. They were astonished by the technology, the steel, braces, the prosthetic limbs, the machines that used electric current to restore muscle strength. In Germany, such devices were rare, reserved for officers. Here, every soldier, regardless of rank, received the same care. That democratic spirit stunned them more than any weapon had. News of their presence spread through the hospital community. Some Americans protested, believing the enemy deserved only prison, not privilege. Others argued that compassion toward the defeated proved moral superiority. For the U.S. military, the optics mattered. Every photograph of a German nurse assisting an American medic was proof that democracy had nothing to fear from decency. Yet for the women themselves, it was not politics but simple human contact that left the deepest mark. When one of them, Anna Weiss, helped deliver a baby for the wife of an American officer, she cried afterward not from joy, but from the unbearable contrast between creation and destruction. "I never thought I would bring life in the land that killed my brother," she whispered. By summer, the line between captor and captive blurred further. German and American nurses began sharing techniques, trading instruments, even teaching each other songs. One evening, during a power outage, the women sang lullabies in 2 languages under the flicker of emergency lamps. A young U.S. nurse later recalled that moment as the first time she realized the war was truly ending. "Their voices," she said, "sounded like home." For the German women, that night was the first in years they felt neither fear nor duty, just the fragile comfort of being human. But the war was not yet over. News from Europe arrived in fragments: Allied armies crossing the Rhine, concentration camps liberated, cities burning. The nurses were forced to confront the truth of what their country had done. Some broke down, refusing to believe the reports of atrocities. Others wept in silence, unable to reconcile their oaths as healers with the crimes committed in their nation's name. For them, America's mercy became both salvation and punishment. It forced them to see that compassion could exist even after everything had been betrayed. When Germany finally surrendered in May, the mood at the hospitals changed. The American staff celebrated quietly. The German nurses stood in stunned silence. Their homeland was gone, divided, and occupied. Yet amid that loss, something fragile and redemptive had emerged. The very people they were taught to fear had treated them with dignity. They had been called enemies. But here they were witnesses to the power of mercy that asked for nothing in return. That summer, as transport ships prepared to send prisoners home, the German nurses gathered in the courtyard of Walter Reed. The Americans who had worked beside them lined up to say goodbye. There were no speeches, only handshakes, a few tears, and awkward smiles between uniforms of 2 nations that had once vowed to destroy each other. For one brief, unforgettable moment, war and peace coexisted in the same heartbeat, the echo of gunfire replaced by the quiet rhythm of healing hands. The engines roared to life, carrying them back toward a shattered continent. Behind them, the hospital windows glowed with light, a symbol of what humanity could look like when hatred finally ran out of strength. The women would never forget that light, nor the strange, humbling truth they learned beneath it. Sometimes the fiercest act of victory is not to conquer an enemy, but to care for one. The ship carrying the German nurses back to Europe cut through a grey Atlantic fog, its steel hull echoing with the creak of chains and the hum of engines. Each woman stood along the railing, watching the ocean roll endlessly beneath them. America faded into mist, leaving behind a paradox they could not explain. They had arrived as prisoners and departed as something else entirely, perhaps not free, but changed. For months, they had worked beside Americans who treated them not as enemies, but as equals in service to the wounded. The memory of that care now weighed heavily against the ruins they were returning to. No one spoke of it aloud. The nurses simply stared east, toward a homeland they could no longer recognize, wondering if compassion had a place left there. When the transport docked at Le Havre, France, the reality of post-war Europe hit like cold rain. The docks were a wasteland of twisted cranes and shattered warehouses. Refugees crowded the shore, begging for food or passage. Allied soldiers shouted orders in English and French, their uniforms sharp against the chaos. The German nurses were processed through interrogation tents, fingerprints, photographs, questions about rank and service. Their Red Cross insignias earned them leniency, but suspicion lingered in every glance. The once proud nurses found themselves stripped of authority, reduced to civilians with nothing but the memories of sterile white corridors and quiet American decency. The journey home through the ruins of Germany was a pilgrimage through loss. Every mile was a reminder of what the war had devoured. Towns lay flattened, bridges blown apart, forests stripped bare by artillery. Children scavenged through rubble, women traded bread for soap, and old men stared blankly at the horizon where smoke still drifted. The nurses passed through Cologne, Dresden, Frankfurt, each city a scar on the earth. The smell of ash hung over everything. In that silence, they began to grasp the scale of their nation's fall. The Reich that once promised eternal glory had left behind only hunger and ghosts. When they finally reached the temporary camps for repatriated medical workers, the contrast with America was almost unbearable. The barracks were cold, the cots thin, and food scarce. Yet what hurt most was the bitterness of their own people. Civilians spat at them, calling them collaborators or cowards. "You served the enemy," one man hissed as a nurse passed. To him, kindness from Americans was betrayal. The women said nothing. They had seen enough of cruelty to know that silence could be its own form of strength. Still, at night, they whispered to each other about the hospital wards in Washington, the warmth, the steady electricity, the strange peace that had felt almost like forgiveness. Over the following months, Allied authorities assigned the nurses to various medical facilities across occupied Germany. They tended to civilians, malnourished children, and even former soldiers hiding from the shame of defeat. Supplies were short. They worked with rags for bandages and boiled rainwater for sterilization. Yet what they had learned in America transformed their approach. They introduced triage systems, hygiene protocols, and patient tracking, small innovations that saved countless lives. American compassion had not only softened them, it had trained them. And now, in the ruins, they applied those lessons. With quiet determination. "We will rebuild by healing," one of them said. It became their unspoken creed, but the psychological wounds ran deeper than any infection. Many of the nurses struggled with nightmares, reliving the screams of the dying mixed with memories of clean hospital wards and soft English voices. Some wrote letters to the American medics they had worked beside, uncertain if they would ever reach their destination. One letter, preserved decades later, began with a haunting line: "You showed us what humanity looks like when uniforms fall away." Few received replies, but that did not matter. Writing was a way to preserve the fragile hope that decency could survive even after catastrophe. As Germany's reconstruction began, the role of these women quietly expanded. Under U.S. Army supervision, they helped establish new hospitals and train local nurses in modern practices. American officers often visited to inspect progress, surprised to find their former captives running wards with discipline and grace. The irony was not lost on anyone. Once the German Red Cross had served an empire. Now, it served humanity itself. The women no longer wore swastikas or iron crosses. Their uniforms bore only one symbol, a red cross that no longer represented ideology, only mercy. Despite their contributions, they were haunted by the past. The Nuremberg trials were broadcast across Germany, revealing the full horror of the camps. For nurses who had dedicated their lives to saving others, the revelations were unbearable. Some collapsed in tears, others refused to believe, insisting it must be propaganda. But as photographs emerged, the skeletal faces, the mass graves, the truth became undeniable. They had sworn an oath to protect life under a regime that had industrialized death. That contradiction tore at them more painfully than any punishment. One nurse, Anna Weiss, who had once delivered a child in an American hospital, visited a displaced persons camp near Munich and volunteered there for months. "I must repay what was given to me," she said softly to an Allied officer who recognized her from Washington. Over time, whispers spread through the ruins, stories of German nurses who had been treated kindly by Americans and who now worked tirelessly to heal others. To some, these women became symbols of moral redemption, proof that compassion could cross even the deepest divides. To others, they remained reminders of shame, but among themselves, they held on to a private truth. that mercy, once given, never really fades. It travels from hand to hand, wound to wound, until it becomes something larger than forgiveness, an inheritance of humanity itself. In 1947, a small group of those nurses was invited to a medical conference in Geneva, representing post-war Germany for the first time. They arrived in modest uniforms, bearing no rank or decoration. When an American colonel approached them, they froze until he smiled and extended his hand. It was Dr. Robert Hayes, one of the surgeons they had served under at Walter Reed. "You taught us something too," he said, "that even the defeated can choose to heal." The room fell silent as he spoke. For the nurses, that moment was the closure they had not known they needed. They had come full circle, not as prisoners, not as victors, but as witnesses to the fragile endurance of decency. When they returned home, they carried with them not souvenirs or medals, but a philosophy. In every ward they ran, every wound they dressed, the lessons of their captivity lived on. They refused to allow patients to be categorized by nation or politics. To them, suffering had no language, and compassion needed no translation. A generation later, their students would form the backbone of Germany's new medical system, one shaped not by ideology, but by the quiet ethics learned in an American hospital during war. By the early 1952, most of the women had faded into obscurity. They married, raised families, and rarely spoke of their years in uniform. Yet, in small ways, their legacy endured in every clean ward, every patient treated with dignity, every young nurse taught that mercy is not weakness but strength. For the rest of their lives, when they sat in silence and the memories of the war returned, they would remember not the bombs or the pain, but the moment an American doctor handed them a scalpel and said, "Help me save him." It was the moment their captivity ended, not in law, but in spirit. And so, amid the ruins of a fallen empire, German nurses who once served the Reich became healers of a new world. They had learned that kindness could outlast propaganda, that mercy could rebuild where power had destroyed, and that sometimes the truest victory does not come from the battlefield, but from the steady, unbroken rhythm of hands that choose to heal instead of harm. By 1948, the transformation was nearly complete. Across the American and British occupation zones, hospitals that had once been makeshift barracks now pulsed with life. White sheets replaced burlap, medical charts replaced guesswork, and morphine flowed from American supply lines into German wards. The women who had returned from captivity were now chief nurses, administrators, and mentors. Their hands, once trembling with shame, guided a new generation born into rubble, but trained to rebuild. In these halls, where echoes of air raid sirens once haunted every heart, there was now only the hum of sterilizers and the quiet murmur of healing. For many of these nurses, the change was deeply personal. Their time in American hospitals had altered their sense of identity in ways they couldn't explain. They had entered as soldiers loyal to a cause, hardened by propaganda, and emerged as caretakers for humanity itself. That shift didn't happen overnight. It grew slowly. Each time an American orderly offered them coffee instead of contempt. Each time a wounded soldier smiled in gratitude instead of fear. Compassion had dissolved ideology. Now, as they trained apprentices in Munich, Stuttgart, and Hamburg, they carried forward that same gentleness, insisting that medicine must never again serve hate. The Allied Control Council noted the phenomenon in post-war reports. German medical staff, once indoctrinated under National Socialist doctrine, were demonstrating remarkable cooperation and humanitarian initiative. Some American officers called it the nurses' peace, a quiet campaign waged not with rifles or tanks, but with bandages and discipline. Former prisoners were now the architects of recovery. When American observers toured rebuilt hospitals, they often found portraits of Florence Nightingale and Clara Barton hanging beside those of nameless local heroes. These walls told a story not of defeat, but of rebirth. Yet beneath this quiet success lay a tension few could articulate. Many of the women wrestled with guilt that no training could erase. They had served under a flag that turned healing into hierarchy, saving some, condemning others. Even as they practiced compassion, they carried the weight of what their country had done in the name of purity and progress. Every child they treated, every survivor they helped, felt like an act of penance. One nurse, Marguerite Braun, kept a diary in which she wrote, "I cannot undo what was done, but I can choose, every day, to be the opposite of what they made me." Her words captured the spirit of a generation learning to live with ghosts. As the Cold War dawned, many of these women found themselves again on the fault lines of ideology, this time between East and West. In East Germany, Soviet administrators sought to reshape the healthcare system under socialist principles. Some former POW nurses were recruited to teach, their American experience viewed as both an asset and a threat. In the West, US officials encouraged them to modernize further, sending grants and equipment. The same women who had once stitched battlefield wounds were now navigating political wounds that divided their homeland in two. But wherever they served, they carried an unspoken code: neutrality, humanity, and quiet resistance to political manipulation. Their influence extended far beyond the wards. In 1951, the University of Heidelberg re-established its nursing faculty, and several former POW nurses joined as instructors. They rewrote textbooks that had once glorified racial purity, replacing them with lessons on international ethics, patient rights, and trauma psychology. Their teaching emphasized what they had learned abroad: that dignity must be preserved even when the world burns. Some of their American mentors sent letters of support, describing how German compassion had surprised them too. Out of shared suffering had come mutual respect. Public opinion toward these women remained divided. To veterans, they were reminders of surrender. To the younger generation, they were symbols of moral courage. A few newspapers in the 1950 seconds ran stories about the nurses who found mercy in captivity, sparking debate across a nation still learning how to grieve. But the women themselves shunned the spotlight. They preferred the anonymity of night shifts and long corridors, where the only sounds were footsteps and the steady ticking of clocks. Their reward was not fame, but the quiet knowledge that their hands had helped close the wounds of war. As West Germany rebuilt under the Marshall Plan, the ethos these women carried began to echo in its hospitals and clinics. The emphasis on humanitarian medicine, on care over conquest, became a cornerstone of the new republic's identity. International exchange programs were established, and German nurses traveled to the U.S. and Britain for further training. Decades later, historians would trace that cultural bridge back to the POW wards of 1945. There, amid pain and uncertainty, two former enemies had discovered a truth older than war: that healing is a universal language. By the 1960 seconds, many of the former POW nurses were nearing retirement. Their hair had turned silver, their posture stooped from years of lifting patients, but their memories remained vivid. They still spoke of the moment they first touched American soil, expecting punishment and finding compassion instead. Some visited the United States again, not as prisoners, but as honored guests. At medical conferences in New York and Washington, they met with doctors who had once been their overseers. The reunions were quiet, marked by handshakes and tears. One surgeon reportedly said, "You came to us as prisoners and left as teachers." The words carried more weight than any medal could. For those who stayed behind, life settled into rhythm. Hospitals became their world: clean, ordered, efficient. The younger nurses they trained had grown up in peace, unaware of the moral storms their mentors had weathered. Sometimes, when a young nurse complained about exhaustion or shortages, one of the older women would smile faintly and say, "You should have seen 1945. It wasn't a rebuke, just a reminder. Everything they had now, sterility, structure, stability, had been bought with the lessons of ruin. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, a few of the surviving nurses were still alive to see it. Some traveled east to reunite with colleagues they hadn't seen in 40 years. Their reunion was humble, but profound. They gathered in a rebuilt Dresden hospital, once bombed into ashes, now shining with glass and light. Together they stood before a memorial plaque dedicated to all who healed when the world was broken. None of them spoke for several minutes. There were only tears, tears for the patients they had lost, for the nations that had clashed, and for the compassion that had somehow survived it all. Their story remains a footnote in the vast ledger of World War II, a small, fragile thread in a tapestry of destruction. Yet in that thread lies something extraordinary. proof that decency can survive captivity, that mercy can outlast propaganda, and that even in defeat, a nation can find redemption through care. The German nurses who once crossed the ocean in chains left behind no monuments, no medals, and no speeches. Only a quiet legacy, one that pulses still in hospitals from Berlin to Boston. Because in the end, history may remember who won and who lost. But the truest victory, the one that endures beyond borders and empires, belongs to those who chose to heal. It belongs to the hands that steadied the dying, to the women who rebuilt, not with stone or steel, but with compassion. And it belongs to the belief, born in the ruins of 1945, that even after the darkest of wars, humanity can still find its way back to the light.